In June 1962, three men disappeared from what the United States government had built to be inescapable. No bodies were ever found. No confirmed sightings were ever verified. The FBI investigated for 17 years and closed the case. The U.S. Marshals never did. Alcatraz, the island 1 mile from San Francisco, was supposed to be the end of the line. For three men, it may have been something else entirely. Most people who visit San Francisco today know Alcatraz as a landmark, a ferry destination, a place to take photographs, walk through old corridors, and read plaques about a prison that closed more than 60 years ago. But the island carries something else, something that the photographs rarely capture. It is a place where America chose to send the people it feared most, and then spent decades arguing about what that choice meant. And somewhere beneath the surface of the official story, there is a mystery that has never been fully resolved. The island's history begins long before any prison. Spanish explorers charted the bay in the late 18th century and noted a small rocky island populated almost entirely by birds. They named it La Isla de los Alcatrazes, commonly translated as the Island of the Pelicans. It was not a beautiful island. It had little fresh water, poor soil, and strong, unpredictable currents surrounding it on all sides. What it had was isolation. By the mid-1800s, the United States military recognized that isolation as an asset. The island became a military fortification, one of the first on the Pacific coast, and later served as a military prison during and after the American Civil War. For most of its early history, Alcatraz was simply a remote garrison, functional, forgotten by most of the country. But the 20th century was about to change that. In 1934, during one of the most turbulent periods in American history, the federal government made a decision. The country was deep in the Prohibition era's aftermath. Organized crime had grown powerful. Criminals with national reputations seemed untouchable, moving between prisons, bribing officials, escaping with alarming regularity from facilities that were poorly secured and easily corrupted. The government needed a different kind of prison. Alcatraz was converted into a federal penitentiary that year. It was designed from the beginning to be different, more secure than anything else in the federal system, more isolated, more controlled. It would hold the inmates considered most dangerous to manage, not necessarily the most violent, but the most disruptive. Escape artists, those who corrupted other facilities, and those whose reputations made them symbols the government wanted contained. The message was clear: if you ended up on Alcatraz, you had run out of other options. Some of the most recognized names in American criminal history passed through its cells. Al Capone arrived in 1934, one of the most famous men in the country. On Alcatraz, that fame meant very little. The prison operated on a strict system of uniformity. Every inmate followed the same routine. No special privileges, no negotiation. By most historical accounts, Capone found Alcatraz deeply difficult. The control was unlike anything he had experienced in other institutions. He spent his time there in relative obscurity and left a diminished man. Robert Stroud, known to the public as the Birdman of Alcatraz, also served time on the island. His story, later dramatized in film, gave him a romantic reputation as a self-taught ornithologist confined in a solitary cell. The reality was more complicated. Stroud spent most of his time at Alcatraz in the hospital unit, not keeping birds. The birds from the famous story were actually from an earlier institution, Leavenworth, where Stroud had been held before his transfer. The mythology that grew around him was, in many ways, larger than the man himself. This pattern, The gap between reputation and reality runs throughout the story of Alcatraz. The island was cold, windswept, and perpetually damp. The bay's salt air corroded everything. Maintenance costs were extraordinary, reportedly several times higher than comparable federal facilities on the mainland. Guards and their families lived on the island as well, in a small residential community with its own school and recreation area. It was, in many respects, an entire closed world. Inmates were permitted basic rights: meals, clothing, shelter, and medical care. Privileges, work assignments, library access, recreational time could be earned through good behavior. But the rules were strict and consistently enforced. Over the 29 years the prison operated, 14 separate escape attempts were recorded. 36 men were involved in total. The majority were recaptured quickly, some found on the island itself, others in the water nearby. Historical accounts indicate that among those 36 men, at least 2 are believed to have drowned and several were shot during attempts, though the precise figures have varied across different records. 23 were caught and returned to custody. 5 were listed as missing, presumed to have drowned in the cold, swift currents of the bay. The theory behind the institution was containment through consistency. Remove every variable, remove every opportunity. If the environment was controlled completely enough, the routine, the isolation, the architecture itself, then the system would hold. For most of its operational history, that theory seemed to work, but the system had a weakness, and 3 men had found it. On the morning of June 12, 1962, guards discovered something that had not happened at Alcatraz before. 3 inmates were gone: Frank Lee Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin. Their beds held papier-mâché heads, carefully constructed with real hair collected over months. Their cells, when examined closely, revealed months of patient, methodical work. Using tools improvised from spoons, a broken vacuum motor, and other materials gathered quietly over time, they had carved through the concrete around ventilation grates in their cells. They had built access into an unmonitored service corridor behind the cell block. They had constructed makeshift life preservers in a raft, assembled, according to investigators, from a large number of raincoats reportedly gathered over months. And sometime during the night they had simply left. The bay, when searched, yielded very little. Some pieces of material, a paddle, a waterproof bag containing personal items belonging to one of the Anglins. No bodies, no confirmed trail on land, no confirmed sightings that could be verified. The FBI investigated for 17 years before officially closing the case in 1979, concluding that the 3 men had most likely drowned in the bay. The U.S. Marshals Service, however, has never closed its file. Technically, the case remains open. What happened to Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers is to this day unresolved. In the decades since 1962, the story has taken on a life of its own. In 2013, a letter surfaced claiming to be written by John Anglin. The letter, if genuine, would suggest he lived for decades after the escape, eventually dying of cancer. The FBI examined the letter, but the physical evidence available was insufficient to confirm or rule out its authenticity, and the agency reached no definitive conclusion about whether it was genuine. The question of its authenticity remains unresolved. Various analyses over the years have attempted to model the tides and currents of that particular night. Some researchers have suggested that, under the right conditions, a determined swimmer with flotation could have reached land north of the city. Others maintain that the combination of cold water temperatures, strong currents, and the improvised nature of their equipment made survival extremely unlikely. Neither position has been proven. What remains is the question, and the question is perhaps the point. Alcatraz was supposed to be the place there was no way out of, and for 3 men on one June night, the record simply ends. The escape had taken place in June 1962. Less than a year later, the prison itself was gone. The closure had nothing to do with what Morris and the Anglins had done. The decision had been made on other grounds entirely. Operating costs had become unsustainable. The island's infrastructure was deteriorating. The federal government determined that rebuilding and maintaining Alcatraz was no longer practical when more modern facilities existed on the mainland. The prison closed on March 21, 1963. The last prisoners were transferred, the guards and their families departed. The island was left largely empty. For several years it remained that way. Without inmates, without guards, and without clear purpose. In 1969, a group of Native American activists, citing what they described as treaty rights under an 1868 federal agreement that they argued returned unused federal land to indigenous peoples, occupied the island in a protest that lasted 19 months. The occupation, known as Indians of All Nations, drew national attention to indigenous land rights and the federal government's obligations. It was one of the most prominent acts of indigenous civil rights activism in American history, and it changed the political conversation around Native rights in the United States. This chapter of Alcatraz's history is sometimes overlooked in the focus on the prison years, but it is part of what the island is and what it represents. In 1972, Alcatraz became part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, managed by the National Park Service. It opened to the public as a historic site in 1973. Today, it receives well over 1 million visitors each year. Walking through Alcatraz now, the silence is one of the first things visitors describe. The cell house is still largely intact. The rows of narrow cells, the low ceilings, the echo of footsteps on the old floors. The physical space has not been dramatically altered. You can still see the marks where Morris and the Anglin brothers worked through their cell walls. The ventilation shaft they used is still visible. The dining hall, the recreation yard, the warden's office, all of it preserved in a kind of suspended, faded state. The cell dimensions alone, far smaller than most visitors expect, make the history tangible without any further explanation. The isolation is already present in the architecture itself, and locals have long carried their own stories about the island. Reports of strange sounds in the cell house at night, a feeling of unease in certain corridors, the kind of accounts that gather naturally around places with difficult histories. Whether those accounts reflect anything more than the power of atmosphere and history, the way an old building holds the weight of what happened inside it, is something each visitor seems to decide for themselves. Alcatraz does not confirm those stories. It simply does not deny them either. What is it that Alcatraz actually represents? It was built on the belief that complete control was possible, that if you removed every variable, isolated people completely enough, made escape impossible, then order would hold. And in many ways, it worked. For most of its operation, it functioned exactly as designed, but it also produced the 1962 escape. 3 men who spent months quietly and methodically finding the one weakness in what was supposed to be an unbreakable system. It produced a 19-month occupation that helped change American civil rights history. It produced stories that have lasted 60 years and show no sign of fading. A prison designed to erase its inmates from public memory became one of the most visited and discussed historical sites in the United States. There is something worth reflecting on there. The island sits in the bay as it always has. The pelicans still gather on its shores. The fog still rolls in from the Pacific on certain mornings, softening the outline of the old cell house until it looks almost unreal. The ferry still crosses from the pier each day, bringing visitors who walk the same corridors, ask the same questions, and stand in front of the same cells, wondering what it meant to be held in a place like this and whether 3 men on a cold June night in 1962 actually made it to the other side of the water. No one knows for certain, and perhaps that is precisely why the island still holds our attention. The hidden histories of famous places have a way of staying with you. The questions that history left open, the stories that sit just beneath the surface of what we think we know. If that's what draws you in, consider subscribing. There are more cities, more forgotten stories, and more unanswered questions waiting.